afternoon. I think when people organize these panels and conferences, they put a title to the conference, and then they see all the panelists one by one kind of deconstructing it, changing it, and talking about whatever they want to talk about. And I feel like that's what I'm going to do now, so I apologize. But when I heard the term of Jewish extremism, I think there's a need for us for a moment to actually address what is it that we're talking about. When we say Jewish, what do we actually mean by that word? And when we say extremism, what do we mean by that word? And if to start from the Jewish, obviously there's a lot of different definitions that go around that term. And I, as Adam, won't talk about the religious definitions of that, and possibly Alec will be able to talk about that a little bit more. But it's important to understand that, at least in the context that I come from in Israeli Jewish society, Jewish is not just a religion. If you look at Israeli ID cards, under the nationality clause, it would say Jewish. And even though they changed it now and the ID doesn't actually say that, still the registry of the Ministry of Interior classifies as your nationality as Jewish, not just your religion. And when I talk about or think about Jewish extremism, in this context, I think it's important to put it in a scope of nationalism, and not just looking at a religion in that aspect. So that's as far as how I'm going to treat the question of Jewish. And the issue of extremism, again, is obviously a very relative term, right? When we think about extremists, we think about kind of the fringe of society. If you think about Jewish extremism, you might be kind of picturing what we call the hilltop youth, the kind of settler movement youth that go up to hilltops in the West Bank and start outposts, and they'll be the ones who will also be kind of very violent towards Palestinians on a very physical level, and kind of, we have that image of extremism. What I would actually like to talk about is looking at what happens when actually the mainstream opinion is extreme. And that extremism doesn't have to necessarily be the fringe, although that's kind of what the word is taking us into. But today, if you look at Israeli politics, the entire spectrum of it should be considered as extreme. I think that we make a mistake if we kind of try to differentiate the extremists from what mainstream Israeli establishment is today. And if we just take the last week, because there's always examples from the last week, no matter when you're speaking. Now we had last week this bill, or the amendment to the Entry to Israel law, the 27th Amendment. Some of you might have heard of it. I'm sure some of you are actually thinking, can I visit next time I come? Will I be let in? But for those of you who haven't heard of it, what this amendment does is that it forces the Ministry of Interior to not give permits, visas, and things of the sort to people who support a boycott or are part of a boycott. So even if you just committed to participate in one, and the definition of boycott is boycott of Israel, any of its institutions, or any territory that it holds. I wonder what they mean by that definition. So it's a very general law that will, again, affect a lot of the people here. But I think for me what's interesting is seeing who pushed that forward. Does anyone know who the main member of Knesset who wrote that bill is, from what party he is? You want to hazard any guesses? Abait Yehudi, Naftali Bennett, that's a lot of what was coming out here. No, it came out of Kulanu. Kulanu is seen in Israeli society as a center party. Okay, it came out of the Likud, but it also has some labor people in it. It's seen as a center party, and that's the people who brought up this bill. And the language that they use around it is saying, they actually say, you can have national pride and still believe in human rights. That's part of the explanation to that bill. Trust me, I have no idea what the connection between that bill and that sentence is, but it's important to understand that extremism is mainstreamed. And I'll try to a little bit talk about how I think that some of that is constructed, and also it's fair to say, kind of, Adam gave quite a historical overview. My generation has a very different experience, because my generation are people who, their starting point is where Adam finished his talk, right? The Camp David, I was 10 when Camp David happened. I don't think that anything that happened before that really affected my life or my politics. And obviously people younger than me, even more so. That's not part of our experience. I'm training to be a teacher, so I teach in this school in the south of Jerusalem. And part of the time we teach and part of the time we observe. So we see other teachers teaching, and I was observing a class of 9th graders. So these are 14, 15-year-old kids. And the teacher was trying to explain about the difference between right and left in Israel and the political system. And so what she did is she went around a class of 19 students and asked them if they're right-wing or left-wing and why. And out of 19 students, 19 said that they're right-wing. That was not really a question. 17 of the 19, their reasoning for why they are right-wing is we hate Arabs. Now, again, this is just a random class in a school in Jerusalem. That's not the extreme of anything. That is right now the way that these people are brought up. And it's important to remember, we're talking about 14, 15-year-old kids. Don't know how about you, but I can't blame them for that. That's not their responsibility, that those are the responses coming out of them. That said, in 3 years, they will be with an M16 assault rifle, standing in checkpoints, right? We can talk about whose responsibility in education system and stuff like that, but these things have very, very clear consequences. So if I'm trying to kind of explain how I see some of that extremism being brought, there is something to say about this, the last generation, the kind of post-Camp David generation, which there's two main things to say about us. The first is, as Adam said, we actually have no hope. Nobody has ever presented an alternative to us in our lifetime that you can seriously look at and say, okay, that might be a possibility for something different. Right? Nobody has had a serious negotiation since Camp David. There's nothing on the table. Nobody's offering anything. And so the idea for us, really the only reality that we're presented, or the only future that we're presented with, is maintaining the status quo. And this is true for both Palestinians and Israelis, right? We just have not had a serious alternative presented. The other thing that is worth noticing is that the segregation between the two societies has increased in those years. And I mean, the checkpoint system started in the mid-90s, the wall in the beginning of the 2000s. So kind of the segregation has also very much increased, and it has its effect. But I think that talking about those things to the level is a little bit, I mean, we like being nostalgic about the periods before that, and especially those of us who weren't there, so we can be nostalgic very easily about it. But I think that there's also a danger in that. Because if I really try to think about kind of the core values that create the class that I walked into the other day and kind of create a lot of the hatred around this, they started far before the Camp David Accords failed, and my father grew up in that mindset just the same. And that is a mindset that is based on this idea that the whole state, the whole society around us is created on the basic idea that Jews need a place to be in order to protect themselves. So it's based on a very, very fundamental place of fear. That's where our society comes from. And the solution offered to that fear, we say it's a state, right? People say to protect the Jews, you have to create an Israeli state. What we kind of mean by that is that we have to create an Israeli military. We don't say that. But what we're actually saying is the Jews need their own military to protect themselves. A state is a mechanism in which you create a military. And those two things, the fundamental fear that we come from and our basis for a response to that, which is the military, are things that are fundamental for the state, for Israeli Jewish society, and I think have to create the extremism that we live in now. Because if the idea is that you really believe, and this is how we're raised, that everyone has always tried to kill us, that as Jews, that is what people try to do. Probably my favorite example of how this is constructed is in the holiday season between April and May, more or less. It's a month that starts with Passover. And I imagine in a Sabeel conference, everyone knows what the story of Passover is, right? More or less. So Exodus from Egypt, and the main commandment of Passover, does anyone know that? And Alec, you can't participate. Remember, great, remembrance. And as Adam said, in religions you can often take different things of what is it that you remember, right? And there's amazing things to remember out of that holiday. At the same time, there's also other narratives that you can remember, and at least kind of the very classic memories that I have of that, the songs that we sing together in the family dinner. One of the songs that you sing in the Passover dinner translates into, in every generation someone tries to exterminate us and then God saves us from them, right? So this is also a story that you can remember and take out of Passover. And I think is part of the Israeli narrative into that. And then exactly a week after Passover ends is the Holocaust Memorial Day. And exactly a week after that is the Soldiers' Memorial Day. And literally the next morning is Independence Day. And in many ways, I think that's a really good snapshot of Israeli mentality, right? This idea that everyone has always tried to kill us, and this has been the case for 3,000 years, and you should tell this from generation to generation and remember that. And then the worst example of what that could look like is obviously the Holocaust. And then there's a solution to all of that, which is soldiers still dying. I mean, you're still in that status quo, but creating a state, but creating a solution for you within that. And in many ways, that's the place that we're stuck in. And when you are in that space of kind of defending yourself all the time or feeling you're always being persecuted, then it means that when things actually do happen in Jerusalem, I mean, I grew up in Jerusalem in the Second Intifada. Buses were blowing up in the streets. That was a reality, right? And I was told in this education system that everyone has always tried to kill us, and you go outside and people are trying to kill you. And it fits into that narrative. And I think that one of the most dangerous things that creates is that when it just fits into a narrative of what's been happening for 3,000 years, then you don't have to ask the question why. I mean, if you go back to October 2015, there were two 14-year-old girls from Hebron, Palestinian girls, who came into the market in Jerusalem and possibly tried to stab people with scissors and were shot dead. As a society, I would like us to say, what would make a 14-year-old girl do that? That should be the first question asked. But if you have an answer that has been the reality for 3,000 years and it's just how things are, then you don't ask that question. And that means that we don't see any alternatives to what's called living on our sword. And if these kids in that school, about 3 or 4 hours after that class, a Palestinian in a truck ran over a group of soldiers at a junction in the neighborhood of that school. And we can sit and ask that question. Why would he do that, knowing that he will be killed, knowing his family's house would be demolished? These are important questions to ask, and starting to understand the reality of Jabal Mukabbel, Sulbahir, the neighborhood that he came from, just adjacent to this Jewish settlement that these kids live in, and kind of what his realities are. We can talk about that and try to, not necessarily legitimize it, but understand it and understand the fundamental differences, changes that need to happen for that to change. But for these kids, that's not the case. You don't ask that question. They just said that they're right-wing because they hate Arabs, and then Arabs tried to kill people just next to them, so they're going to be right-wing because they hate Arabs. And it feeds into that same narrative. So I think when we talk about extremism, we really need to talk about kind of the fear that it comes from, and how do we also have a responsibility to try to, on the one hand, break that fear and understand it and try to give people a sense of security, and at the same time not allow that fear and that extremism to be legitimate. Because the fact that we understand where it comes from, the fact that we can do that analysis and say, okay, they're 14-year-old kids, does not mean that when they stand with a gun in a checkpoint in 4 years, they don't have the responsibility for what they're doing. They do have a responsibility. But we also have a responsibility of trying to change that narrative to allow them to step out of extremism. Because it's very easy to talk about religious extremism or national extremism from our nice kind of cushiony position of saying that's not us, but the reality is that is our responsibility. It's definitely my responsibility as an Israeli who lives here, and next year we'll be teaching in these schools and we'll need to teach these kids. But I do think it's also a responsibility of the international community of understanding how you change your narratives within your own communities as well. Because if we really want to challenge that extremism, we need to give it an alternative. And that's, again, an alternative that at the moment doesn't exist. So that would be kind of my request from you, is to first of all challenge these extremisms also in your own community, whatever they look like. And again, we'll keep going back to Trump just because this is a big issue at the moment. But for the Americans in the room, this is something that you need to deal with. And again, extremism is not a bunch of fanatic, white supremacists, anti-Semite, Islamophobic, homophobes. It's your president. Like, this is mainstream. So how do we take responsibility of changing that mainstream extremism and shifting it back to the extreme?